Uvlalutuk uvanya ataga Liz anupik sam kanyak. Quiana Puck Aton, Quiana Seminole. Good afternoon, my name is Liz. My Inupiaq name is Snow Goose, and I always give thanks to God before I do any presentation, and I also thank the original ancestors of this land, which are the Seminole. All right, I'm going to give you a little insight into family and life during the times in Alaska. It was a territory until 1959 when Edward Curtis traveled up there to photograph some amazing, amazing photographs. They might have been staged, but if you go to Olin Mills, what do? They're staged photos, right? Have to happen, right? But I want to give you a little perspective of what Edward Curtis had to do to travel up there. The state of Alaska, not only is it the largest state in the United States, but when you look at the land, you can only imagine what he had to do in order to make his way up there, traveling from the east all the way across the United States to the western part and then traveling up. And yes, he spent a lot of hours and had a lot of equipment. I'm going to give you just a little insight into my life, into the Native life. And one of the pictures, and it's kind of blurry, but it's part of Edward Curtis's. It came from, I pulled it from either the Smithsonian or the Library of I think it was the Library of Congress. But it's entitled The Journey of a Lifetime, Arriving Home, No Attack. Well, No Attack was where he met my great uncle, which is a great cousin rather, Paul Ivanoff. Paul Ivanoff was his guide through Alaska. And I was thankful that he chose my cousin Paul, because Paul, not only did he speak pretty good English, but he also spoke two other native tongues, Inupiaq as well as Siberian Yupik. So he was very well versed in the areas that they were going to. And this photograph of my cousin Paul, very attractive man, and I thought, yeah, I'm sure that he had a lot of insight into Edward Curtis. One of the things that I have to admit is that I am grateful that Edward Curtis went up to Alaska. Otherwise, I would have never had a photograph of my family. I would have never had a photograph of my mother. My mother is the child. She was about 4 years old. At the age of 5, she was taken away by the nuns at St. Mary and put into boarding school. She couldn't speak English. Their language was taken away, and when she finished 8th grade, she was sent back home, not knowing any of her native language, which is Inupiaq. That's why I strive to learn, and that's why I continued my education. You know, and one thing about Edward Curtis that I can say is that when you have a dream or you have some kind of determination that you have to do something, it doesn't matter what happens, you're going to do it anyway, no matter what it is. And one of the things that I had a goal that I wanted to get my master's degree by the time that my husband and I's oldest son graduated from high school. And I woke up and realized, oh my gosh, he's going to graduate from high school and I don't have my master's. So I did my master's degree in two semesters. And working 2 jobs, 3 jobs if you count working from home, right? Being a parent. And then afterwards, I was encouraged because one of my master's papers, and it also ended up being my master's thesis paper, was on the Alaska Native Corporation of the 13th Regional Corporation. And my professor encouraged me to continue my education. He said, don't waste any more time. You don't need another master's degree. Just continue on, and then you go out and you teach. And I said, oh, okay, I'll do that. And I did. But had it not been for Edward Curtis that put that determination, because I thought about him and thought about all the hours that he put in and his determination. Granted, when you think about life, it's like on a continuum. Different things happen, the government, the lifestyle, conveniences, the food, everything is a little different if you go on a continuum of time. You think about your life when you were 5 and you think about your life today. A lot of things have transpired. Well, granted, back then, I'm sure he thought that the natives would be assimilated, because if you went up to Alaska or anywhere, any store, restaurant, hotel, the sign said, no dogs, no natives. So I can understand why he thought that they would be assimilated. There have been attempts, but I think we're better than Catholics, aren't we? We have more natives now because we believe in family. So we have the same values as the church. You know, we want to be good to other people. So I can understand why he was so determined. But during that time, you have to understand that life was very difficult up there in Alaska for him. Just to give you, this is just a portion of the map of Alaska. And there's Norvik. My mother was born in Norvik. It's right off the Kobuk River. And during that time, my grandfather and my grandmother were on the trail, and they would travel around because he was the last traditional chief in our village, the village of Unalakleet. And what he would do is, in his area, he would hear about people who need help, and they would travel out, kids in tow, by dog sled. Now, all these places that you see where Edward Curtis went to take pictures, his photographs, you can't get there unless you either barge in by water. Very difficult to fly in some places. But the other thing is that you could go by snow machine, but remember, snow machines weren't back then, so it would be by dog sled, right? So, and Noatak is actually where my parents were, my grandmother and grandfather and my mother were photographed, along with, there were some other pictures, and I have the unpublished Alaska from the Edward Curtis Foundation that have other pictures of my family in there. But this remote area, keep in mind that back then, we didn't have stores. Everybody bartered in the village. A traditional village, you bartered. They were subsistence livers. They lived off of the land, which meant that if there was a caribou going by and you're hungry, well, you shoot it, right? Or, well, they didn't have a lot of guns, so they probably used bow and arrow. Anyway, but they also were whaling. I have family members who are whalers. But everything was very difficult back then. Severe weather. I'm flying back to Alaska tomorrow, and I'm going into negative 39 degrees. So, when you think about some of the things that Edward Curtis endured, imagine carrying around the plates. And I'm thinking, glass. You know how glass shatters in the cold? Very difficult. So for him, I can see that he was extremely driven sometimes it could make you a little mad, and we were talking about Mad Hatters earlier, but I can understand that when you have a mission that you think you have to fulfill, nothing is going to stop you. But one of the things that Edward Curtis did for us is he gave us something that we can go back and be proud of. We survived. We have living proof that our relatives were able to live in remote areas. So the Inupiaq region goes from, you'll see it's all in red there, the red arrows, is mostly the upper portion of Alaska. Unalakleet is the most southern Inupiaq village there is. And in Alaska, the reason why I'm thankful that he chose my cousin, Paul Ivanoff, is because there are 20 languages in the state of Alaska. So why him? And sometimes I say, well, things are just, they were meant to be. And so that was meant to be, just like you were meant to be here, and I was meant to meet these two gentlemen. Got a lot of information from both of my colleagues, which I absolutely, it solidified my thoughts on Edward Curtis. One of the things that I can say is the remoteness is still there. Things are still difficult, all right? I would like to explain how I met John Graybill, who's the great-grandson of Edward Curtis. So Edward Curtis did take this picture of my grandparents and my mother, and John was at I want to say, how they have those, I'm trying to think of the right word, they have these big conventions for girls who are getting married, couples, and a wedding, they have different tables and stuff, and I'm not sure what it's called, but they had all these vendors there, photographers, people who are selling cake and doing pictures, and my niece is a wedding cake maker, and she had a table at this venue. And a friend of hers happened to be passing by John Graybill's booth and saw this picture. And he said, hey, my girlfriend's grandmother is that little girl. It just happened to be passing by. And so that's how we met the Graybills. And that's how John contacted me, because my niece said, oh, Aunt Liz knows everything about Alaska, blah, blah, blah. And she was going on, and she has this book, and she has all the pictures. And so what we did is we scheduled a time, and my mother was the only living descendant at the time. She did pass away 3 years ago at 99, but John Graybill, for part of the Descendants project, interviewed my mother. So, and I said, and I'm a firm believer that things come full circle and everything happens for a reason. So my grandmother was a very beautiful woman. She died when she was in her 40s, all right? But she is a person who had the kindest heart, would do anything for any of the other families in the surrounding villages. And Edward Curtis took this picture of my mother, and you're going to notice how my mother's fingers are together. And I asked my mother, why did you have your fingers like that? Oh, because they were white men, and we had to keep their spirits away from us. So, and I said, oh, well, actually, they called them Gusik Shishekos, the round eyes. And she said that was something that she learned from all her little friends that she would play with. Keep everything together, keep them away from you, so it's her safety area. She wasn't happy here. And I know somebody mentioned that Yeah, Edward Curtis said, finally, smiling faces. Well, typically, I know that I'm going to refer to us as Eskimo, all right, which is fine. I'm not offended by it because there are Yupik, Kupik, Siberian. I'm a Nupiaq. There are several different kinds of Inuit people, Eskimos, all right. Anyway, my mother was upset that she had to put the parka on. And the parka, by the way, and I have several of them because I do live in Alaska and work in Alaska. You'll see this ruff here. This is actually called a sunshine ruff. The reason why it's called a sunshine, because if it was all up, it looks like the sunshine. It is wolverine because snow does not stick to wolverine, and you can pull it completely around. But usually our parkas are completely, a lot of, back then, it was primarily all skin. Seal skin, wolverine, fox, beaver, all right? And it keeps you warm during the severe winters. This is my Uncle Charlie, my great Uncle Charlie. I have a brother who looks just like him. I said, oh man, are you sure that you're from this family and not Uncle Charlie's family? Well, anyway, Uncle Charlie was a single man, and I happened to be in a store in Santa Fe, and she had the photogravure of Uncle Charlie. And I have that now in my possession because Charlie needed to come home. Uncle Charlie needed to come home. So he's home with me. And he is and I know that they called them in Edward Curtis's writing. I think that was my only issue with some of the writing is that he would call our clothing costumes. This is not a costume. This is how I go to work. I make my own kusbuks. You can call them a kusbuk, a tigalik. The skirt portion determines whether you're male or female. I mean, I think some people have a little difficulty with that. But if I'm in my parka in the snow and you can't see anything, they identify you by your parka, all right? So they know me when I'm coming with my parka on. So I have several parkas. But the tigalik, this is designed, this is a summer one, all right? But it's loose in the back so that you can carry a child. So, and keep the child warm. That's why so many Alaska natives are bow-legged, because the kids were always on the back. And I said, that's okay. It keeps them from falling down on the ice, right? And this is Nunavik Island. And this is, there you can see the child on the back. And they have all, back then, they only had skin parkas and atigaliks. During the summer, though, they're all cotton. Thankfully, when the Jewish people came in, they brought a lot of stores in, and they would do a lot of trading. And so we would trade for furs for actual material, which was kind of nice because, instead of the flour sacks. I'm thinking of the South, flour sacks, But here's a picture, and you'll see my grandfather. He's a little older with his 3 brothers. And I told you that one of my brothers, standing to the left of my grandfather, is one of my uncles. And my brother, Bill, looks exactly like him. And I'm thinking, gosh, are you sure you're from this family? But my mother always said that when, certain people, they skip generations. And so it's like our daughter, my husband and I's daughter, looks exactly like Ola. Same chin, same facial features. So, and you'll see how they're dressed. This is the standard. These are standard clothing. So they're not costumes. Just want to tell you, not costumes. And here is one of Edward Curtis's pictures, Eskimos in kayaks in no attack. And this is a picture I took in my native village of Unalakleet. And this is my cousin, Paul Ivanoff, by the way, a descendant of my other cousin. And I guess they didn't get, they had to choose Christian names, all right? So, but when I'm in the village, I'm Kunyak, all right? So that's my native name. That picture, they said, you want to come in? Heck, no. I am not getting in that tiny little thing and running around. Why are you going to do that? Oh, looking for fish, right? And there's my cousin Conrad Panupchuk. And I took this because I was living in Unalakleet. And you'll notice that you always carry a gun with you when you go out. You never know what kind of animals are going to be there, right? But you'll see the machine in the back that would pull materials and supplies, all right? Thankfully, we have snow machines instead of dogs. But the culture, living in two worlds, I think about some of the things that my ancestors went through the pictures that Edward Curtis took. And I'm so grateful because I would have never had those. I wouldn't have been able to see my family. I wouldn't have been able to connect with some of the things that they had to endure. And then when I complain about something, I'm thinking, what are you complaining about? Look what your Aunt Betty had to put up with. You know, look what your cousin had to put up with. No. So I'm grateful. But it is a little difficult living in two worlds because back in the time when Edward Curtis was traveling around, yes, there was a lot of racism, all right? There was a little difficulty because it wasn't until 1945 when Elizabeth Perodovich went before the state legislature asking for an anti-discrimination law. So they passed it in 1945, long before the Civil Rights Act in the lower 48. But this is I took this picture in 2005 when I was flying out of Unalakleet. That's the village. You can only get there by plane now. You can barge in because it's off the Norton Sound. You have to go through the Bering Sea. Or the other thing you can do is you can take a dog sled in, which they do the first weekend of every March for the Iditarod. But the snow machines is called the Iron Dog, which is going on right now. I think they've ended. I think there's already a winner for the Iron Dog race. And we are one of the stops. All right, so in the Iditarod, we were one of the stops, the last checkpoint before going into Nome. So during the time when Edward Curtis was photographing, they did some of the same things that they do now. We have, we have different ice things going on. The blanket toss. No, thank you. I like to keep my feet flat on the ground. But they use a whale skin and you get on the blanket and everybody's throwing you up and you have to land. I said, yeah, knowing me, they'd probably throw me out in the sound, so I'm not going to do that. But, a lot of things they had to do inside, and I'm thinking, okay, Edward Curtis traveled up there, and I believe he was there in summer and into the fall. When it starts getting cold in the fall, sometimes you can't get out. all right, because it's pretty blizzardy. And this is a cousin and her daughter. And you'll see that the frost sticks, all right? So they're out there on a snow machine. And I said, "You doing that for activities? You know, for leisure?" Gosh, why don't you go in and bead or sew, you know, or bake bread. Anyway, but they love being outside. But you'll notice that they have a different rough. If it were a sunshine rough, the snow would not stick to it. And this is the mode of transportation. There's another relative of mine out looking for seal. All right, seal hunting, because we do eat off the land. All right, we buy very little processed foods. Usually, and this is the same thing they had to do when Edward Curtis went in, but I'm sure he took regular food provisions with him. And gosh, when you think about all the cans of food he had to take, good grief, along with the glass and all his equipment. Well, let's see, what do I need? Am I going to take my glass plates, or am I going to take 50 pounds of food? Plates, food. Oh, I'll do the plates. Yeah, and then you rely on the natives for local subsistence. But like I said, it's a subsistence lifestyle. We fish, we hunt, you know, we do a lot of things. You know, the diet in that area where Edward Curtis was is primarily caribou. They had seal, you know, so fish, a lot of fish. And this is the native village of Unalakleet. I took this picture in 2006. This is one of the Iditarod racers that were coming into the village. So, and by the way, Unalakleet in Inupiaq stands for where the east wind blows, and it blows and blows. So it was pretty windy that day. And that is our village transportation, but it is the most beautiful land. And I'm sure that Edward Curtis, the photos that he took, I can only imagine what they looked like back then in real life. And current transportation, it gets a little rough. And this is me with my sunshine parka on the edge of the Arctic Ocean in Utqiagvik, which is formerly Barrow, Alaska. Utqiagvik in Inupiaq stands for snowy white owl, because there's a lot of white owls up there. And the arches are part of the whale. The times and temperature that Edward Curtis had to endure, especially in the, you know, if you're there during the winter, it's pretty extreme. And I had to throw this picture in, the -40. And then, you know, when you're way up north, it's prevalent. You see a lot of bears out. But during the summer, we do a lot of salmon drying, because that's our main staple throughout the year. This is me going to work at 11 a.m. at the university during winter. But I must admit, my traffic jam is like 2 cars. Unlike my drive here from Orlando. And summer, this is 4 a.m. So I'm sure that Edward Curtis, I was listening how he sat up and he was writing everything. And I'm thinking, oh, I bet you he loved our summers, because the sun never goes down. I mean, if it does go down, it's like dusk and then it pops right back up. I love it during the summer. But one of the things that I can say that Edward Curtis helped me with is not only learning through the pictures, because you can, you know that old saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words? Absolutely. It might have been staged, but guess what? It wasn't staged. All right? You can see the faces of people. Yeah, some people might be smiling, but the other thing that you see is you can see that you learn a lot, because when you read the notes of Edward Curtis, it almost feels like you're there with him when he was making notations. So some of his unpublished works, or if you go through to the archives, you can read some of his notes. And there is a connection there, and a lot of wildlife, and more wildlife. And life in the village, although it might be simple and it can be brutal, one of the things that Edward Curtis did is that he was able to link some connection with my cousin Paul. So Paul trusted him, because back then they were very leery of strangers coming into the village. And I will admit that today they are very cautious still, only because when we became, when the missionaries went in and they started putting the children in schools, it made it very difficult, because imagine you and your husband not speaking the language, and someone in a black and white outfit, a nun or a priest, took your 5-year-old daughter and said, "This is for the best," and you wouldn't see her again until she finished 8th grade. That's very difficult. And so that's part of the documentation when you look at those photos that Edward Curtis took, because it shows, you know what, they were doing fine. The people were fine, They were happy. They knew what they were doing. But one thing I can say about rural Alaska life is some of the remote areas that was traveled with all the equipment was probably a journey that was very, very difficult. And to accomplish what he accomplished, when I think about him starting out on the East Coast and going all the way, yeah, granted, his wife dumped him, and he was thrown in jail. But when you think about it, I thought, wow, him being gone that long, that's almost like being a military wife, because they go on bivouacs and they're out in the field, and they go to war, but at least they come back, But he was on a mission, and I think he was so pressed to try to get everything done that he neglected truly living. But I think he lived through his photos, and you could see that he enjoyed himself through his photos. He really did. So this is another picture. We were out snow machining out of Unalakleet, and always enjoy spending time with my cousins. This is dusk. This is the windy, it can't be the Windy City, but it's the Windy Village. And this is a picture of my grandfather's home in Unalakleet to the right. And that's my cousin Conrad on the left. I took a picture of him, and I said, I have to get a picture of my grandfather's home. And so that is his home. And he spent many, many years there. But one thing I've learned through all the photos is when I go through all 20 volumes is that we're not alone. I have met more wonderful people because I go to the res, it's the business economic development seminar in Las Vegas. I meet a lot of people there. Do a lot of work. I did a lot of work for the Ute, Mountain Ute, and the Southern Ute reservations, the only 2 reservations in the state of Colorado. And we're all together. And we have a combined purpose of survival and making this world a better place. And I think the only thing that concerns me is that there's a lot of cement. a lot. Because I don't mind a road here and there, but you'll notice this is a gravel road. So we have gravel roads, but it's not a road that connects to anything. It just goes out to the fishing hole, no. But anyway, when you look at the terrain and you look at everything from the pictures, and I was so stunned by the pictures that was taken before and then after with all those trees, and I'm thinking, wow, what a difference. But I can honestly say that life comes full circle, and we will survive. The natives have survived. And my cousin Betty Ivanoff Menard, she was the first Alaska Native woman to reach the summit, and she said, I had to do it. So she had that tenacity, just like Edward Curtis did, because he was on a mission. She was on a mission. So, but I do want to say Quiana and Quiana Puck, thank you very much to Edward Curtis, because had he not done that, I would not have seen pictures, whoops, sorry about that, of this is my great-grandmother, Lena Williams, that Edward Curtis took a picture of. And this is part of the unpublished Alaska from the Edward Curtis Foundation. And so they sent me a complimentary copy. And when they released it, I was in Las Vegas. We had this huge display. Some of my cousins were there, and so we all took a picture because we're all linked to Lena. And somebody asked me, I wonder why she was such a sad face. And I said, well, I heard, and this was from my aunt Mary Lou, said that she always hated to go into the village. She lived a nomadic lifestyle and lived away from the village because it was too much activity for her in the village. I thought, wow, she's a better woman than I am. But I come from strong genes. I will not live a nomadic lifestyle. But if I have to, I'm going to find somebody who can hunt and fish. All right, I want to thank you very much for allowing me to share a little bit of how Edward Curtis linked all my family and how we all share some of the common threads of the appreciation for the work that he did and what he had to endure. And when you go home and cook dinner, just remember, you're not going to be lugging all those glass plates and equipment. Thank you.